Welcome everybody, this is Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors.
And this is Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors Group.
We'd like to welcome you to our K-12 Politics and Tech video series.
Our objective is to give you the absolute latest of what's going on in Sacramento that affects public school districts, obviously, and as well as all the technology stuff that's going on that's so vital to delivering for kids these days.
And remember, if you find these videos useful, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share out over social media. You're our marketing team. We appreciate your support, and let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody, Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors, back with another episode of K-12 Politics and Tech. As always, Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors, co-host of the show, is here. Kevin, glad you're here.
Great to be with you, Tim.
Yeah, so let's get started with the fact that the legislature's been gone a month, but there's still tons of news to report. So tell us about the latest news there, please.
Well, obviously, the big news this week is the governor's requirement that school districts implement either a vaccine, which every employee in schools will have to undergo, or the alternative, if they don't get vaccinated, will be testing. And this testing requirement, if you kind of look at the order that was signed by Tomas Aragon, the state health director, it says in there that you need to make sure that you're keeping detailed records of all of this stuff. And so there's going to be, that's probably the biggest challenge. I think the education community by and large, and we've seen an outpouring of support by all the major organizations and labor unions in favor of this, but that documentation stuff is probably going to be the heavy lift. Not just that, but also standing up a testing regimen for those that don't end up getting vaccinated is going to have its challenges. So we've been in conversation with the governor's office, in the last day or so, and they are actually making efforts to try to make those things easier for school districts. So while it wasn't all announced on the day that the governor did his press conference down in Alameda County, they are working on ways to template or make that reporting process easier. And then we are aware of at least one entity that's been approved by the state, is a partner with the state, with CDPH, that has the capacity to do mobile testing where they take care of everything. So they would show up at your site and they would do the testing. They would do all of the stuff that you need to do to, get results and all that sort of thing. So there are going to be some options for school districts, I think, to make things a little bit easier. It would be nice if, instead of creating the anxiety that everyone feels like they actually have to separately solve this problem, if we had all of the solutions up front. But we're going to help try to facilitate some of these answers, and we appreciate the governor's office and the work they're doing to try to make that reporting requirement a little bit easier. So it's not real, everything's not real clear just yet, but we know that the mandate, if you will, kicks in by October 15th. So we got a little bit of time in terms of implementation. So people should feel like they don't have to rush to try to have all the answers today, but we're going to be having some answers probably within a week or so.
Well, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, we definitely feel for our education leader friends who have yet another tricky problem to sort through with this testing and the logistics and the funding, like you mentioned. So thanks for sharing that with us, and of course, we'll keep everybody updated there. I know back in DC, there's been a lot of back and forth over a couple of big initiatives that both need to get passed, but just fill us in on the budget versus the infrastructure package and just kind of what you're hearing back there in DC, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. But when we got together last time with Governor Bob Weiss, who was sort of reporting what we called the four-ring circus back in Washington, D.C., it's because they're trying to multitask and do a number of different things simultaneously. Obviously, it looks like we're having progress, remarkable progress on the infrastructure package. But at the same time, there's this budget reconciliation, which is a budget ask of $3.5 trillion. And it's affecting the politics of all of this. I think the disposition in terms of a bipartisan basis is to get this infrastructure thing done, but we know that the speaker wants to try to tie the things together. The important thing about the infrastructure package that I think at the end of the day is going to go is that it did drop out the school construction component that was $100 billion. So people are trying to look at whether or not that's going to show up somewhere else. But it had $50 billion for construction, $50 billion that actually bought down the interest rate, affected, our financing for school facilities in an important way. Again, not part of the package. So the biggest part of that infrastructure package, as you well know, that impacts public schools is going to be the broadband stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And I'll just say, hearing about that turmoil back and forth, and sort of, I guess putting our budget off potentially to pass this one sounds a little scary, especially we're already delayed and they're potentially delaying it more. And also a little bit frustrating, again, just to hear about the facilities stuff coming out that everyone desperately needs, or the folks that haven't been fortunate enough to pass a bond desperately need. So yeah, so thanks for bringing up the broadband, the broadband issue. And infrastructure, Biden's infrastructure broadband package, which is part of this larger package, $65 billion. Remember, at one point it was somewhere between 40 and 100 billion to solve the problem. 65 is a nice slice down the middle. And basically, there's a lot of talk now because there's a lot more information about what this actually means. Like, there's some detail within the 65 billion. About 45 billion is going to be for building out networks across the U.S. Running fiber, things that we've talked about in the past. And just interestingly, remember that FCC came out with the emergency broadband benefit. There's about $14 billion in here to continue that. It's hard to say how long that will go because we don't know how much of it's being consumed. But again, there's actually very significant chunk in there to subsidize broadband for families who can't afford it. Still, when you read about this in the news, depending on what you read, there's a lot of the same old ways of building out broadband. And if you remember, Biden had come out and said that there were going to be a lot more regulation. They're going to be a lot tougher on the providers. But when the bill actually sort of shows up, it doesn't have a lot of the teeth that was promised. So the good news is we're going to get more connectivity around the U.S. There's going to be some subsidized broadband. The bad news is you're expecting big changes about how the way things typically work. We may not see it there. But again, we've made progress, and we're looking forward to that passing because it's going to take us a little while to see that. So Kevin, we talked about the legislature being gone. We know they're coming back next week. Tell us, some of the top things that are going on back there as people are coming back that we expect to see solved when they get back.
Yeah, so we just wanted to remind people, as the legislature finishes its work for this year, which it'll do in the next 30 days, that there are a couple of issues still outstanding that have been part of the conversation. One is the bill by Assemblymember Jose Medina, and that's AB 388. With regard to ethnic studies. So that's going to get done. He's worked really hard on amendments to that legislation. So I think they're going to get that all wrapped up, and we'll see that move forward. And fully expecting the governor will ultimately sign that legislation. That, of course, will mandate that course in ethnic studies for school districts as a part of graduation requirements all across the state. And then there's AB 438 by Assemblymember Reyes. And again, this is her attempt to apply the current layoff requirements that we have for certificated staff to our classified people. And we've had conversations with her about this. She believed this was an issue that she needed to give voice to. She's really close to the classified employee unions. It's an issue, at least they believe, of equity. Obviously, for public school districts across the state, it complicates that whole layoff process. I mean, and then to the extent that, people want to be sympathetic to labor, I get it. The one downside of this policy that applies both certificated and classified is the idea that we just don't have any idea about what kind of budgets we have in any given year by the time you get to a March layoff requirement. I mean, given the fact that sometimes we don't even have a clear picture at the May revision, let alone what's going to be in the final budget act, the idea that we've got to make a decision about the following fiscal year by March 15th has always been, in my view, kind of a bad idea. But again, it's about employee protections, and our union friends are definitely pursuing this, is just in handicapping it. I think there's no problem with this bill likely getting through the hurdles of making it to the governor's desk. The question will be if the governor thinks that that's the right thing to do. And presuming that this legislation lands on the governor's desk before September 14th, I suspect he ends up signing the legislation. So we'll see what happens with it. But those are two bills that we're watching. I'm getting a lot of questions about the late start bill that Senator Portantino had gotten signed into law and its implications for a year from now, and folks hoping that there might be some delay in that. There's some work still going on with regard to this issue. I'm just not optimistic that we're going to see any legislative changes to that legislation. Senator Portantino feels very strongly about it. He still plays a very influential role in the legislature. And so my anticipation is that we're probably not going to see a lot of movement on that issue. So as we're trying to get back to normalcy in public schools across the state, an added complication will be the implementation of that late start measure. Again, there's some consideration about maybe moving it back 1 year. I'm just not so sure we're going to see that. But just wanted to update those things so it's on people's radar screen. These are some of the things that are going to be talked about as the legislature comes back.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, we'll look forward to more updates on that as this progresses and we get more news. So thank you for sharing. We talked a little bit about the FCC. There's a couple big pieces of news this week. One is the end of the filing window for Emergency Connectivity Fund is basically this weekend here. So if you are one of the folks who did not have a chance or you were not able to get your application in, unfortunately, I've heard from many of my leader friends that they just didn't have enough bandwidth, or the timing window was bad. The team was on vacation to get this application submitted. It was a little more challenging than people had anticipated. And based on talking to John Harrington, the CEO of Funds for Learning, who's one of the top minds in this area, I don't even think we're going to get half of that consumed. And I'd be surprised if we do. What they said was if we don't consume all 7.1 billion of those dollars, and you remember these dollars were to get kids laptops up to $400 per device, up to $250 for a hotspot, which of course everyone would love to participate in given the time and the resources. You'd love to access those funds. They said basically if they don't consume all the dollars, they're going to open a new window shortly thereafter. And the reason why I bring this up is because if this was on your radar, but you didn't have the time, there's some simple surveys that were slowing people down in the application process, which is basically asking your community who out there has adequate device for 3 years, who needs connectivity in their homes. It's not adequate enough to do a video broadcast like this. Those surveys are simple. They're important whether you want to, access this funding or not. So I highly recommend that you just take a quick look at those types of surveys. They're not extensive, but perhaps you can get your team working on this. By the time the next window opens, you can access these funds, and that'll be a big win for you because these are a significant chunk of dollars. They're going to help you get updated devices that will last your school quite a while. The other big piece of news on the FCC is, remember at one point during the pandemic, the FCC admitted that their broadband coverage maps were terrible. They'd been given to them by the service providers, of course, who were trying to sell us more cell coverage. So what they did was they actually put a plan out to go out and investigate to see where the cell coverage was and wasn't. Now, I'm very excited about that because when you think about technology projects, starting a project without the facts and without kind of a baseline of knowledge, there's all kinds of failure points there, right? You might be overbuying, you might be underbuying. And so I'm excited that the federal government actually has these maps in place. And as you remember, we're bringing in $65 billion to build out connectivity in places that we don't have it. And I want to draw a correlation back over to your district. If you're going to buy a bunch of new gear, a bunch of new equipment, a bunch of new stuff to run at your sites or to run, on your extended networks, and you haven't taken the time to investigate what you have, this is definitely a best practice. Take some time this fall, get a baseline, and then make, basically act on the facts that you gather rather than kind of what you're hoping to do. So I'm going to jump off my soapbox. And Kevin, one of the hottest topics I think everybody's talking about right now is independent study and the distance learning challenges that creates. I know you've been doing a lot of advocacy back in Sacramento for this. So please tell us what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, as one of our last issues today, it without question is probably the most important burning issue for school districts across the state. And that is the fact that the legislature very deliberately used independent study as the vehicle for us to use to deliver distance learning. And that what was not anticipated by the legislature was the Delta variant and the demand for distance learning by parents under the circumstances, and the inability of their solution to scale up to handle the number of kids that we're going to have to address. And as a result, we're coming back to the legislature and the governor and asking for some modifications to the statute to give districts some flexibility. This approach using independent study was always one we kind of were scratching our head about because it's probably one of the more cumbersome programs that we have in K-12. But, the idea of, the contracts up front, the teacher, parent, pupil conferences that are mandated for each and every kid that you're putting into the system. And as we have hundreds of kids signing up for this, and school just, that also the lateness of when the legislature acted on this gave districts little time to sort of navigate this and get things set up. Confusion in the field about whether or not they could contract with providers who do independent study really well. That door has been shut. A number of different legal opinions that gave districts different kind of signals. And finally, the fact that was put out by the California Department of Education to try to bring clarity to what you actually cannot do and what you can do. Again, it's very, very complicated. And our goal in the next week is to really get in front of the legislative staff and the governor's office key points on what can be done to help remedy some of these problems as much as that can happen in what will hopefully be some swift action for cleanup. But again, we want to sort of downplay expectations a little bit because there is a reticence by staff and legislators to give us a lot of flexibility because they just felt like there wasn't as much accountability as they would have liked last year. And the one thing they really don't want to have happen is it to be easy enough that, folks in the education community go back to the idea that we're going to simply close all the schools completely and not be open again. And the legislature does not want that to happen. So hopefully the measures that are taking place, along with real serious consideration of things that will make this process easier, will take place and we'll get some of this sorted out. But it is probably the most complicated issue, causing a lot of consternation in school districts across the state, and we just have to try to deal with it. So that's what's on that. And then I was going to also mention, Tim, on the FCC, that we're putting together a meeting. I think it's going to be in a week or two, and it's going to be with the chair of the FCC, Jessica Rosenworcel, who I know you're really familiar with, a big champion that we're lucky to have at the FCC on K-12 issues and connectivity. She's always been in favor of seeing E-rate expanded in ways that the education community has always supported. We're putting that meeting together with the executive directors of the statewide associations who are great leaders in public education in California. Those names, Wes Smith and Vernon Billy and Tim Taylor, Karen Staff Walters, some of the major leaders in the education community are going to have that conversation, and we're happy to host it.
Well, thanks for putting that together, Kevin, and I would love to hear some of the outcomes of that call or just some of the conversations on one of these updates here in the near future. So thanks for sharing that and doing that good work. So I just want to wrap with one thing. We talked about the USC Rossier Innovative District Leadership Academy. That is going to be launching January 22nd. And we're excited to be launching that in partnership with Digital Advisors and USC. We had a call this week with the USC team with 3 grads of this program in the past, Jerry Almendarez, Holly Eads, and Heather Olson, who's the superintendent up in Pacifica. Holly's superintendent in Orcutt, and Jerry, if you don't know, is superintendent in Santa Ana. They're all graduates of the program. They're just talking about their experience. We're going to link this webinar that we recorded to the little email that goes out. We're going to put the link under the YouTube file just so people can have a chance to check it out. And if you're interested, please send your teams. We talked about several issues on this call today where you get changing marching orders. How do you lead through some of these initiatives and complex challenges that involve technology? That's exactly what this course will give you, a skill set to go ahead and navigate this rapidly changing world that we all live in. And you'll get to hear these grads who talk about how it's impacted their career for the long term. So really appreciate the opportunity. If you get a chance, watch that. If you enjoy it, please spread the word. And we appreciate you all tuning into this today. So Kevin, thank you so much for sharing, and we'll have lots of news in upcoming weeks, and maybe we'll have Bob back to tell us what's going on in DC if they ever sort that stuff out.
Sounds great.
Okay, have a great weekend. Thank you.
So thanks again for joining us for another week of this broadcast.
And I just want to take a moment to remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and share this out over social media. Again, you're our marketing team. I'll also finish by saying, if you have some questions, please send them our way. We'd be happy to address them on a future broadcast. So with that, thanks everybody, and we'll talk soon.